Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment, and I want to welcome you all here for an environmental conversation that this afternoon we're calling Safe and Reliable, the Future of California Water. All of you know that there's no issue that's more important for California's history and California's future than securing a safe and reliable water supply. There's probably also no issue that's more complicated and more worthy of scholarship that comes from diverse perspectives that range from the legal and regulatory to the chemical and industrial. And one of the things that we can do in the Stanford Woods Institute is really take a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach to the important issue of water and really try and figure out how we can complement the massive efforts that the state's undertaking and how we can extend a conversation in a way that introduces important topics, that unfolds issues and reveals complexities, but also has the potential to reveal opportunities that might have been hidden. So the format for today's discussion is we're incredibly fortunate to have Joaquin Esquivel, the chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, set the stage. And then we'll have a conversation that will start with us, but the intention is it'll go to all of you. And we really want to have a chance to hear your ideas and see them reflected off of the scholarship, identify new problems, new approaches, and new opportunities for partnerships. So let me start by introducing Joaquin Esquivel, has now for 2 months, I believe, been the chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. He's been on the board for more than a couple of years and a distinguished history, a record in water resources regulation, and more broadly than that, a distinguished record as a legislative director in the Office of Senator Barbara Boxer, where he covered agriculture, Native Americans, water, oceans, and nutrition. And he really brings this breadth to water resources. So Joaquin, it's a pleasure to have you kick this off.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to even come and join everyone for what is going to be, and I'm looking forward to learning and listening to what is going to be a fantastic discussion and panel. So thank you. Yes, my name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm the chair of the Water Board. 2 months in, and at this point I'm taking it month by month, if not day by day. I am fortunate to have been chosen to be the chair of the board in what is certainly a challenging time writ large for California water resources issues. And you really look at the drought, and it focused Californians on water policy in a way that got us the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, allowed us to reach conservation targets of 25%, which were 5% more than the 2020 targets that were 20% by the year 2020 that were out there. It transformed, I think, so many of the discussions we've been having in water, and we were so fortunate to have an administration prior to this that took water as a huge undertaking and set goals and was very ambitious, and now to come into the next administration with Governor Newsom, who is just as passionate, just as goal-driven around our water resource challenges, is fortunate for us because I think that what we are in an era of right now is taking what is so much of the learning that was done, and Chris, you talked about the complexities of California water's challenges and finding the opportunities therein. And so I think that we're in an era now of really starting to quantify. I think you look at the California Water Action Plan from the previous administration, and it was a collection of a synthesis of really good activities that we need to be undertaking. We need to be increasing water recycling. We need to better manage our groundwater resources. We need to better account for what are the needs for watersheds writ large that create the sustainable foundation for all of our activities on water resources in our watersheds. And so it's now kind of about taking all what was accumulation of really good ideas and really starting to say, well, what does that portfolio look like on the watershed scale? What are the activities that we need to be incentivizing, and how do we better start to quantify those? The co-equal goals that were set up now we've had a decade of the co-equal goals with the Delta Reform Act, and now 10 years on, again, we're needing to better quantify what that even means as we try to solve our challenges in the Delta, but also not let the challenges in the Delta define the entire tone and tenor of the discussions around water resources. Because you look throughout the state, whether you're talking at the Salton Sea or up in the Klamath or any of the many other communities across the state, and you look at what they're doing, and there are so many innovative discussions happening. There's such a richness in our understanding, a growing understanding of the complexities of our water challenges, that it's exciting to be able to take lessons and models from other watersheds and say, how do we all just collectively continue to move the ball forward? We can go through the list of challenges that we know that are out there: climate change, aging infrastructure, a lack of investment in that infrastructure, the pullback of the federal government and having really been the source of so many of the resources that built out what we have, and what does it mean now to maintain it, let alone to then the challenge of ensuring access to clean and safe drinking water to the million-plus Californians that don't have access. And it can seem a bit overwhelming, all those challenges. But if you look, the broad sort of brush I sometimes see around the development of California's water resources as Byzantine and Rube Goldberg sort of machine that we've built to manage our water resources, whether on the legal side or the infrastructure side. It was all done because what we encountered in California was incredible complexity. Whether it's the wetter north or the dry south, the variability in our hydrology from year to year, it was all from flood to drought and back again. It required us to build systems in this state, both again legal and physical, that dealt with that uncertainty and dealt with that complexity and kind of streamlined it down to allow us to be 40 million people, the 5th largest economy in the world, the richest state and the richest nation in the world, and all this wealth that we have. But it's a mixed legacy. It's a mixed legacy because it's something to be proud of. It's something that has allowed us to all be here and have these conversations around water resources, but it was also done not understanding those complexities, not understanding that floodplains were there for a reason, that our understanding of these systems, when we built them, the assumptions of the hydrology that they would see in the next the next decades weren't there. And so now we do know more. And the question is, how do we begin to reconcile all of that? And so again, I'm incredibly fortunate to be chair at this time. But I try to diminish this position, just because it's not about the chair seat insofar as I'm a board of 5 here. And so we're all one vote. It takes 3 of us to do anything as an entity. So, and then more importantly, though, the leadership, when we talk about managing California's water resources, we're actually all out there. It's not in this seat. It's not at the board. It is communally amongst us all, and it's about tapping that and democratizing really even our involvement in discussions around water. And the exciting part of it is that you look at the tone and tenor of the discussions that we're having in this state, and they're a decade or two in front of other states, and we're very fortunate to be able to have institutions like Stanford and our academic partners throughout the state that again have allowed us to work in that complexity, to better become sophisticated in our understandings, and then say, well, what does that mean? And what does that mean for the systems going forward? So I'm fortunate to play my small part and role, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. So thank you for the invitation, and look forward to continued discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, why don't the panelists join me on the stage? So it's a pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished panelists. The way we're going to proceed is Joaquin promised that he would answer questions, and I know people will have questions for him. So we'll bring him in as the questions lean in the direction of his expertise. To my extreme right is Nusha Jami. Nusha is the director of the Urban Water Policy Institute in Stanford's Water in the West, and a hydrologist with a long record of tackling important problems in hydrology and in the human dimensions of hydrology. She's a member of the Bay Area Regional Water Quality Control Board, and so has 1 foot in academics and 1 foot as a policymaker. Next is Rob Jackson, who's professor of Earth System Science and currently the chair of the Department of Earth System Science. Rob's a biogeochemist whose expertise spans the range from energy production to ecosystem function. And one area that he's focused on, especially in the last decade or so, has been implications of hydraulic fracturing in the search for oil and gas resources. And then finally, Scott Fendorf, directly next to me, is also a professor of Earth System Science and the senior associate dean in Stanford School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. Scott's an environmental chemist, a soil chemist, and his focus is basically on how bad stuff and good stuff gets from the soil into the water and back. No. So I'm going to start with a question for each of the panelists. Nusha is someone who comes from the topic really with 1 foot in the regulatory space and 1 foot in the academic space. Lay out for us some of the issues with the way regions are tackling the challenge of assuring safe and reliable drinking water.
Sure, thank you so much for the opportunity. Actually, Joaquin laid this down very nicely for me. I think we live in a sort of in a world that we have 19th century laws, 20th century infrastructure, and then 21st century problems, which they don't really match together. And the problem we are facing right now is when we set up this infrastructure system, absolutely at the time it helped us to socioeconomically grow and enabled us to bring all this population here and let them live in wherever they wanted to. Instead of living by the water resources, they lived by the coast, and we brought the water to them. And then we assumed abundance, and we let the water. We use this once-through systems. That we use the water once, and then we cleaned it up and let it go. And because of the way we set up the system, we also set up an institutional setup that we have is also very sort of outdated, because we have people who deal with water quantity and supply, so they clean the water and bring it to us, and then we have people who deal with water quality and wastewater, so they are the people who actually make sure the water that's cleaned up and put back in the environment. The regional board that I sit on, that's our mandate to make sure we preserve and protect our water resources in our region. And then we have institutions that are dealing with stormwater and flood protection. And these sort of institutions are so fragmented they don't talk to each other, which makes it very problematic, because our 21st century challenges require these institutions to work with each other and actually take the wastewater and clean it up and use it as a resource rather than waste and putting it, discharging it. Take stormwater and clean it up and reuse it rather than, again, discharging it. Or actually maybe when we are dealing with flood protection or challenges of rising sea levels and flooding that we are experiencing at different times, we can capture that water and store it in different forms in different places and be able to use it again. Again, these institutions are set up in a very fragmented manner, and it's not just the institutional problem, it's actually also a financial problem, because we are putting money. Each one of these institutions have their own mandates and their own resources, so they allocate those money only to the problems that are related to their mandates. And that creates more fragmentation that we have to deal with in a time that we actually need to have a more coordinated way of managing our resources and partnerships and making sure we can actually allocate these funds and put them together to deal with our emerging water challenges coming from climate change, urbanization, actually aging infrastructure, and so many other ones that we are facing right now. So I'm happy to be here.
So Rob, is the Nusha's setup on the once-through water system really highlights a lot of the issues you think about with deep groundwater resources and with implications of oil and gas exploration. How much of a problem and how much of an opportunity is there in dealing with that coupled opportunity of deep water resources and the implications of oil and gas exploration?
Well, it's definitely both. First of all, it's a little loud. Thanks everyone for being here, and I'll be brief. There are a lot of experts in the room, so we want plenty of time to hear from you. I'd also like to thank Joaquin and the legislature. I think we're saving water in ways that I think are unexpected. Even a bill like SB 100, the Clean Energy Bill, is going to save us water from cooling water uses and such. So there's just a lot of really good things happening in the state. My task was to say a few words about oil and gas operations, water, both potential risks and also opportunities. And as background, my colleagues and I, while I was at Duke, did the first studies of hydraulic fracturing of drinking water, for example. So that's something I know a fair bit about and have studied for a decade. We've also done work here in California on the abundance and quality of groundwater. And then thinking about the proximity, as oil and gas and other operations approach the surface and drinking water resources, we have less sort of room, less buffer for mistakes. And so one thing that's unusual about California is that our hydraulic fracturing is relatively shallow. So half of our wells here in the state are fractured less than 2,000 feet from the surface. And a fair number of wells are within 1,000 feet or so of the surface. And that's very different in other states where we've worked, like Texas and Pennsylvania and North Dakota and such. So again, there's less buffer, if you will. Now, on the other hand, the number one issue to water quality and a lack of contamination is well integrity. And that's no surprise to anybody in the oil and gas industry. And we've certainly found that in other places. And then some other differences in California, we use relatively little water per well. Instead of millions of gallons per well, just 100,000 gallons or so. And we don't hydraulically fracture that many wells a year here in the state, depending on how you define it, 1,000 wells a year or less. So it's not like the Permian or the Bakken or some of the really high producing areas. There are some risks, and I mentioned them. What I think about more, and maybe would like to spend the rest of my time here discussing, is wastewater disposal. We generate 130 billion gallons of wastewater every year from our oil and gas operations. And we have to do something with that water. We're producing 15, 20 barrels of wastewater for every barrel of oil in the state now. It's a mature oil producing industry. We mostly make water. And much of that water is deep injected back underground for enhanced oil recovery. We've got 55,000 Class II injection wells in the state. We've had some trouble in the last 5 years with the EPA and disposing of water in aquifers that didn't have exemptions and things like that. And the state has been working through that issue. There are a couple of other things that people are probably familiar with that are unusual in California. One is that we're the only state that I know of that allows wastewater disposal in unlined percolation pits. And we've had close to 1,000 or so of those in the state. I don't know what the exact count is now. But that's essentially taking the wastewater and allowing it from the top down to migrate into the ground, and occasionally that water goes places that we don't expect. And that's generated a lot of attention as well, so that's something else we could discuss. And then finally, in both the opportunity and the risk category, we're having serious discussions now about using produced wastewater for irrigation. We've got a lot of pretty good quality water that's produced from these oil and gas operations, especially near the Sierra Nevada. And the first contract, I think, is under discussion now down in Pozo Creek to take that water and use it for irrigation in a contractual fashion. And I think some of the issues there are the quality of the water, but are we going to monitor that water for the chemicals and the attributes of that water that we need to beyond basic things like salinity? And what happens to that water, not when you irrigate it for a year, but perhaps a decade or two? So it's really, I think, these long-term issues that in my mind are the main concerns about most of the things that we do, and oil and gas operations are no different.
Great, thank you. Well, Scott, that actually is a great lead-in to the issues you work on, where you can think of these oil and gas residues as, in many cases, natural contaminants to deep groundwater. And a lot of what your work addresses is other kinds of chemicals that can enter the water system, even from much shallower depths, but as a result of the natural geology the state has. What do you see as the key issues we need to be thinking about with natural element contamination and approaches to deal with it?
Yeah. So I would start by noting that we often don't recognize this, but every aquifer, every groundwater system has a contaminant laying in the wait. And the question is really whether it's going to stay in the sediment load or it's going to transfer into the water phase. And that's something we see in California. It's not an exception. I'll deviate from California just for a moment to give you the example where it's probably the global example where it's most exaggerated right now. So in Asia, about a fifth of the groundwater across Asia is contaminated with arsenic. It's all naturally occurring. It's natural processes that get it into the groundwater, but it's still in the groundwater. In California, we have a whole host of different elements that we have to consider. If we're on the western side of the valley, we have to think about things like chromium coming out of the coastal range. On the eastern side and distributed across, we have arsenic and uranium that come out of the granitic materials. We have selenium, we have vanadium. They all are lying in the rock sources that are there that make up now the sediment loads that are actually our aquifer solids. And the question comes up is whether, again, they're going to stay in the solids and be benign and out of sight, or whether they transfer into the water phase. And it turns out there are natural occurring processes that deliver that transfer, but there are things that we do that modify that. So how we pump the groundwater, whether it's a continue drawdown of the aquifer, or whether we're seasonally having it fluctuate very much, that changes how things are going to react. And as an example, something like chromium that comes out of the Coast Range is in a benign form. It gets into the aquifers. As that water table moves up and down, that tends to promote its transfer into hexavalent chromium, which is the Aaron Brockovich, getting dated now, but it used to be the big movie you put out there. It's the Aaron Brockovich form of chromium that's quite hazardous. And that can then, things that we do can modify how it's partitioned. In the eastern side, like I said, you have things like arsenic and uranium that we can modify. And so as an example for arsenic is just by overpumping, a lot of times we see arsenic in clay layers. And so as we overdraft an aquifer, we will start to pull water from that clay layer, and all of a sudden arsenic, which wasn't a problem originally, starts to show its face. And those are things that we have to be cognizant as we manage. As California moves to the 21st century is going to present new challenges from climate change and so on. As we do that, we're going to have to be thinking very significantly how we manage our water system. And a big part of that's going to undoubtedly have to be managed aquifer recharge. And when we go to that direction, we have to be incredibly careful that we manage it such that we keep the contaminants in the solid, these naturally occurring contaminants in the solids, and not accidentally get them into the water phase.
So thanks. That actually is a great juxtaposition to the material that Nusha already spoke of, where the challenge is figuring out how to do more recharge and reuse in the context of a situation where we have additional constraints on recharge with the potential for release of these dangerous contaminants. How's the thinking, especially in something like the Bay Area Regional Water Control Board, about how you think about recharge and reuse in the context of managing the release of contaminants?
Sure. So we have some managed aquifer recharge in Bay Area, especially in, there are a few recycling plants in the Bay Area that they're right now generating drinking water quality recycled water, and they're trying to, currently putting it back on the ground. And those are actually regulated because we are trying to make sure the water quality is protected. But fascinating enough is that fragmentation I was talking about keep coming back, because we do have to deal with how do you recycle water and how do you put it back in the environment. But then it becomes water quantity that needs to, or supply that needs to be used, and that sort of have its own set of regulations and challenges. So it's kind of like that has that sort of disconnect. A lot of the discussion that's happening right now is how do you actually do a little bit smaller kind of managed recharge, which is sort of stormwater capture and recharge, or creating like more green infrastructure that would allow recharge of the urban storm water, which can have other kind of contaminants in there. And there's a great amount of research is going on that's trying to understand how do you set up these green infrastructure systems to make sure that you can capture any pollutant and contaminants or urban pollutants that you don't want to end up in the groundwater system. The second thing is, we have been actually not managing our shallow groundwater as a water supply source before. So a lot of this shallow groundwater is polluted. Think about dry cleaners. we actually, in our region, deal with a lot of groundwater, contaminated groundwater due to dry cleaning material, which have a long legacy, and it's very, very hard to clean up. And case after case, we see communities come to us and that they want the groundwater to be cleaned up, and who's going to pay for it, who's going to clean it up. Some of these has happened like 50 years ago. Who knows who the owner was? How do you sort of bring them back and make sure they clean it up? So it's not just also, so that's also an issue around how do you manage sort of industrial waste that can cause these long-term impacts, especially, again, since we are going to deal with a lot more scarcity as time goes by. These shallow groundwater systems are actually valuable water source that we would like to tap into. So it doesn't matter if we are recharging them with stormwater or wastewater or any other kind of water, or as we can protect them more. It's actually, it's key. And one thing I would say is, as a hydrologist and somebody who never dealt with quality before and now deals with quality a lot more, I find it's always much cheaper to protect the resource rather than go back and clean it up, because it is costly, and it's not just financial cost, it's actually human cost is pretty high too for some of these contaminated groundwater. And so it is a daunting issue, I would say.
Could you comment quickly on the technology aspects of cleaning up these industrial pollutants like the dry cleaning fluids?
Sure.
Can they do that, or is there still science that's needed?
So they can do that. There are these remediation companies that come in and they inject some other chemicals that would, and I need to look at my notes to kind of go through the details of it. But I would say it's still very expensive, and there is a space for making it more efficient, and also coming up with other ways of best management practices of how do you make sure this kind of dry cleaning material or other industrial waste doesn't end up polluting the groundwater. But yes, and I think maybe, I don't know if Scott knows more about these remediations, but there are companies that they do this, and it takes a long, long time. Another issue that we are facing with, which kind of goes back to the question you asked, is identifying how far these plumes are going or which direction they're moving. And I think there is an opportunity there to do a little bit more work to figure out a faster, easier, and more economic way of figuring out the quality challenges and pollution challenges that we are having.
Scott, I know you've been interacting with urban water recharge entities, and I think the story with Orange County is a really interesting one, and their arsenic contamination. And you found them to be quite a willing partner in terms of addressing their issues.
Yeah, yeah, they've been fantastic. So maybe give you a little history on the story. So Orange County so I will give my prejudice first. So I grew up in Santa Cruz in Northern California, snob, and thought that Southern California, we got all the water and they used all the water, and that's the way I grew up. And so I've started working with Orange County Water District about 10 years ago or so, and I'm just so impressed with the way they manage their water. So what they do is that everything is managed around groundwater. So they take all of their water and basically put it into the ground and manage it as an aquifer, stable aquifer, and this aquifer recharge. What they started realizing, though, they take all of the wastewater they can possibly get. They then do secondary processing and bringing it up to really high purity standards, and then they put it back into the ground. So they do that through infiltration ponds, and now they have injection wells. When that water percolates in, it turns out that they have great monitoring, but they started recognizing that it was picking up arsenic as the water was percolating in. So it was all naturally occurring, but it was showing up again. So they teamed up with us to figure out how that was happening, and it turns out, we get into the details, but the quick of it is that their water didn't have enough calcium and magnesium in it. And so simply by adding the calcium and magnesium, the problem goes away. So they amended their infiltration water so that they could add this calcium magnesium back in. The arsenic goes away, no problem averted. And so that was all by having very careful monitoring and then management of the water. And so they have this vast quantity of water now that they're ensuring is managed in a safe way and mitigating these natural
Takes some
contaminants.
pretty tricky chemistry to realize that increase in the calcium and magnesium would make the arsenic stay on the soil.
Yeah, and I will credit them by, they recognized in the monitoring that they needed to figure that problem. And so what they did is teaming up with us was actually fund research to figure out what that problem was. And we gave them the solution and they implemented it. And so it was a really nice teamwork.
Rob, this issue of injecting water that's got bad stuff is exactly what happens in the oil and gas industry. And I wonder if, whether there are lessons from these sort of shallower recharge activities that are relevant, or is the oil and gas problem really one where you've just got to put the contaminated water from oil and gas production in aquifers that are really isolated from all drinking water sources?
Well, the wastewater in the oil and gas industry starts out pretty nasty in most cases, right? It's old, it soaks up elements in it, so it's a matter of isolating it from surface water resources the way it was isolated to start with. So I think it does have some relevance. Nusha talked about managed reinjection, and it seems inevitable that California will do more of that. We have saltwater intrusion issues. We are and will face a longer period of time in summer between snowfall and as the climate warms and such. So it's hard to imagine not doing more managed injection to store water, store excess storm water and things like that. So I think the issue is how much are we willing to spend, and how and for what do we monitor the water that we're injecting, and what are the consequences that might be unforeseen, the kinds of things Scott referred to, or the consequences of things that might be in very, very low concentrations, parts per billion or so, but when added over many years, organics and other things could be a problem, especially in proximity to water that people are using today, and then finally for water that might be used tomorrow. And I think that's the last thought that I had in this vein, which is it's issues of legacy activities. Nusha referred to dry cleaners. We have gas stations. We have hundreds of thousands of legacy oil and gas wells that we no longer use. And how we think about, manage, and ultimately pay for these activities long term has a big effect on the environment. And we're paying for things today that people didn't think about, or if they did think about, didn't care about 50 and 100 years ago. We ought to be thinking about what people will care about 25 and 50 years from today, because as we are.
In that context, Rob, you've written and thought a lot about California's very deep groundwater resources. And how should we think of those as a part of the state's water assets?
California is blessed with a lot of really good quality water, relatively deep underground, and California's not unique in that respect. Other mountainous states, Wyoming, other places where you have tall mountains, water that flows down those mountains very quickly, and that water dives underground. So on the east side of the Kern County, for instance, there's a lot of good quality water. We also have some of our highest oil and gas activity and other activities in those kinds of areas. So one thing we've tried to think about is what are the safeguards for that water? Think about the proximity of different activities near to water that could be used in the future, and that's behind the whole idea of underground sources of drinking water as well that regulates much of what we do to start with. But I personally think we're not thinking about water that people will be using, say, in 25, 50 years. That might be 1,000 feet down or 1,500 feet down, and sort of safeguarding that water for the future. Because ultimately, I think people, for better or worse, have to think about subsidence and lots of other issues. But cities and people and companies are going deeper and deeper in the state to get their groundwater, and we really need to think about that.
And Nusha, do you want to comment on whether the kinds of jurisdictions you deal with are sensitive to issues like how to think about protecting the unusual deep groundwater resources, how to do things like avoiding unnecessary fluctuations in the water table depth?
Sure. So actually, because of a lot of groundwater, dependent on the groundwater in the San Jose area, And where the Santa Clara Valley Water District is right now, their service area actually sunk significantly in the past century, and then they realized it and they started actually maintaining that groundwater, and they started trying to recharge that groundwater and try to sort of protect it over time. And they are actually a great example of how you sort of shift from consumption-based sort of growth to sort of what do we need to do to preserve our resources. So we have that example in the Bay Area. Having said that, there is a lot of thinking going into what kind of resource do we need to use, how groundwater is, especially in the areas that communities are dependent on groundwater, how that groundwater will be used, what percentage of our water supplies will be the groundwater. Is it going to be something that we depend on during the drought, or is it something that we want to depend on at all times? And if that's the case, is the groundwater being recharged fast enough to make sure that over time we have resources to depend on? So having said that, again, I'll go back to the disconnect that exists between supply and quality, which is if I put my regulatory hat on, we do regulate water agencies and utilities, or wastewater utilities, in the way they manage their waste or do recycling or manage recharge. However, we have no control over how they take that water out or how they manage it for consumption. So we really have no say into what they do with that water after they put it on their ground. I think Orange County is a great example that Scott brought up, because they actually went to recharging their groundwater because they had seawater intrusion, and they actually wanted to protect their groundwater sources. So they started cleaning up their wastewater, putting it back on the ground, and then eventually they realized, oh, this is a great resource. Why wouldn't we use it, actually? And we see more and more of that happening in other regions of the state, especially as we're dealing with a lot more scarcity. But Orange County, those two entities there, the group that deals with the groundwater recharge program and their water supply, they're sort of they're not necessarily together, but they're sitting in the same building. So there is a little bit more interaction going on there. But we definitely have a challenge with fragmentation in our institutional systems and the way where our laws and policies are set, which limits us from managing this resource a lot more actively. And I would say we are trying in my team to work at Stanford now, putting my research hat on, to work on these disconnects and the fragmentation that exists, and try to better understand how collaboration and cooperation would allow a better and more coordinated management of these resources. However, it's definitely an emerging area of research, and while there have been a lot of thoughts out there about this, there hasn't been enough work done to make it happen.
I do want to come back to the fragmentation topic, but your comment about managing surface water, groundwater, reservoir water makes me come back to Scott, who's thought a lot about systems where trade-offs are being made between surface water and groundwater. And I wonder if the transition in California to thinking much more about groundwater as a resource to be managed, has, as far as you see it, really been thinking about the right kinds of issues and whether the priorities seem like they're where they should be, both for utilization and for increasing knowledge?
I think things are changing, particularly because of SGMA, but prior to that, and even in the early stages of SGMA, the focus has really been on water quantity and somewhat devoid of thinking about water quality. When water quality was thought of, it was usually around nitrates or pesticides that we're going to potentially get into the shallow groundwater mostly. That is starting to change, and I think that's where we really need to move, is to have a broader thought about what can really jeopardize our water systems. And Rob and Nusha both mentioned this. Through management, we can actually prevent these contaminants from transferring and becoming problematic. And so thinking in advance of what are the processes that stimulate that transfer one direction or the other, usually wanting to promote the ones that are transferring it back to the solid phase or keeping in the solids, and avoid the ones that are promoting it going into the water phase, can really prevent these long-term problems that start to manifest themselves. And there are, we already know, in most cases, we already know so much about the geochemistry and the biogeochemistry that we can have that prediction, and we can run management scenarios that tell us for different geographic areas what the way to get the groundwater, to get surface water into groundwater, through active management that minimizes the risk posed by these natural contaminants. We still have to then backdrop that on things like nitrates and pesticides. I don't want to diminish those because they are something that we have to worry about as well. But those are things that we can manage. So I guess my answer is that through holistic appreciation of the chemistry and the hydrology, you can actively manage these systems in quite a successful way.
Is there a big quantity-quality trade-off where if you're going to do it to preserve the highest water quality, you don't get the quantity that you could if you ignore the quality issues? Or?
There doesn't have to be, no. So that if you think about the systems, and I'll just give a quick example to maybe be realistic. So right now there's been part of the managed recharges through flooding agricultural fields. FloodMAR is the term for that. And that could be really, from my view, quite catastrophic in terms of releasing uranium and chromium. But if you do it appreciably in sandy soils, or if you do it along a central canal, you can do it quite well so that you would not get uranium or chromium manifesting itself in the groundwater, and not jeopardize the quantity that you're getting in either. So it's really about just understanding the system with the chemistry and the hydrology, how those work together. And if you do that, you can still get the quantities in that you would want.
But you need to make sure that there's good education information all along the operational chain.
Yes, and again, just to reiterate, is that you want to work ahead of the game rather than behind the game, so that you want to appreciate how to keep those contaminants from ever getting in the water rather than having to try to clean them back out, because that becomes very expensive.
Well, just to jump in, I mean, it does matter how much we're willing to spend to monitor that water, how often, what we analyze in it before we put it back underground. So there is potentially a trade-off between quality and quantity, but it's also how careful do we want to be, and how much are we willing to spend to monitor it, and who pays for that?
I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you, and so you can start thinking about the questions that you want to ask. I wanted to come back to Anusha's point about fragmentation and maybe start with some of the oil and gas activities where it's not even really water agencies that are primarily responsible for the activities of the producers and the injectors. And what do you see as the needs for getting the oil and gas producers on the same page as the water entities?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question in the audience, in Sacramento especially. Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I mean, Dogger has a long history of managing water. I mean, I think what we're seeing, one thing I alluded to earlier, is that we're seeing in the private sector more oil and gas companies seeing their wastewater as an opportunity. So there's already just a lot more discussion now about what are the ground rules for being able to sell that water to users. You have fields like Elk Hills, west of Bakersfield, that it's pretty much surrounded by agricultural activity. So part of those discussions are being driven by conversations in the private sector and potential transactions that occur. And I think with there is fragmentation though in oil and gas, and not a lot of overlap necessarily with a lot of what's happening with SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that Scott alluded to. And certainly we could do a better job of communication between, making information publicly available about what is the fate of wastewater. Other states do a better job than we do of allowing citizens to track where wastewater goes well by well, for instance, and how it's disposed and where it's disposed. So I think there are many opportunities for better communication and frankly a better integration between what Dogger does for water and the various water agencies operating in California.
Do we have an issue with induced earthquakes with oil and gas injection?
Not the way that a state like Oklahoma has. And as most of you know, I mean, Oklahoma is now more seismically active than California, and it's not fracking. It's it's wastewater disposal. So they're in some areas, and they have made strides in the last few years. If you look at the data, we do have some experts on our campus, people like Bill Ellsworth. I'm not an expert in induced seismicity, but they're making strides. But when they pump too much water underground too quickly, especially down near basement areas, they're basically lubricating faults and speeding up activity that would have occurred naturally over thousands and tens of thousands of years. So to my knowledge, we don't have nearly as much of an issue in that realm. Thankfully, here in California, there are a number of reasons for that. But no, and there may be some experts here in the room that would want to comment on that.
Great. Well, with that, let me turn the questions over to all of you. When you ask a question, let us know who you are, and if you think there's a particular expert who's the right one to answer, you can let us know that as well. But we're really keen to hear your thoughts and your questions. And and wait for the microphone. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Meredith Nickel. My question is is it Nusha?
Yes.
You mentioned that you're doing some new research on how to address fragmentation, and I'm interested if you could describe it just briefly what you're doing, and particularly whether you think Sigma is a part, is that going to help or is it going to hinder those efforts?
Great question. So some of the efforts that we are undertaking in my team is looking at permitting processes, and that's at the local level, regional level, and state level, and trying to understand. I'll give you an example. For example, we want to do a lot more multi-benefit projects that would help water quality and quantity and also deal with sea level rise. And that means that a lot of different jurisdictions get involved in this. And also there's more, it costs more sometimes, or you need to bring money from different entities. So we are actually looking to see what kind of permitting processes do we need to put in place that are suitable for these 21st century solutions that we are sort of promoting. Are our permits right now suited for that? Do we need to have different kind of permits? For example, in the Bay Area, so this is sort of me wearing half my regulatory hat, half my research hat. In the Bay Area, you're not, so some of the regulations that we have is you should not do bay fill. While a lot of the problems, solutions that we have to deal with sea level rise is promoting marshlands and wetlands and horizontal levees, right? So how do you kind of change your permitting process? And some of these actually the work is being done by our staff at the regional board and actually state board, but some of the work that we are doing is more, instead of individual project by individual project permitting, think about how we can make our permitting processes a little bit more flexible to enable that. And some of the other work we are doing is around how do you sort of quantify the benefits of these multi-benefit projects to bring more people to the table to pay for them. If somebody wants more recreation compared to somebody who wants to deal with contaminant of emerging concern, can they actually pool their money and do that? And I forgot the second part of your question.
I was just interested if your research is also looking at Sigma, the system
Oh, actually, great question. So Sigma, I'm a big fan of Sigma. I would say I worked in the legislature the 3 years before Sigma happened, and I know my colleague Dennis O'Connor is sitting there, and I remember at the time he was trying to get some of the laws around groundwater data to go through, and we had such hard time to making that happen, which actually ended up happening during the Sigma process much smoother. And and Dennis had been working on the whole Sigma issue for forever and ever. But my only comment about Sigma is that now we are all so focused on groundwater. We're not doing enough thinking about how these new entities that we are putting in place are going to interact with our other utilities that are sort of dealing with water quantity or water supply. So the ones that have the common jurisdiction, they're going to work together pretty smoothly. But then if we are fragmenting more to manage groundwater, then actually it can be an issue. Another thing is some of the way we have set this up from a financing perspective is not really well put together. So one way to deal with that is to engage more of the existing entities that are involved in managing watersheds and water supply to be more involved and sort of put more money into it as a sort of collective rather than individual. So I think the answer is it's a great first step. I think we have a lot of a long way to go. So.
Another question in the front here. Please.
If I can add just really quick, I look forward to a time in the future when we find ourselves with a drinking water, wastewater, flood control Sigma entity that has collapsed in on itself, and maybe at some point. Anyway.
Yes.
And manage the politics of that one.
I'm Will Price, and I hope you appreciate the fact that I'm a Cal civil engineer, but that's all right. I'm
We're
also
talking about decreasing fragmentation.
Yeah. I'm also a water commissioner for San Joaquin County. And so I'm talking from that perspective first, but also I have a personal issue where I live. I live on a lake in Stockton called Lake Lincoln. There's 220 homes on the lake. It's a stormwater detention basin that then we have to waste into the delta when we don't want to. And so the question now that I'm raising is, can we take that water and use it for irrigation of those 220 homes? Given that my biggest part of my water bill is when I water the lawn. So if we could get that water for maybe no cost, the question that is haunting me is whether the water quality issues coming off the streets and any other way it gets in the storm drain could in fact be a hurdle even for irrigating our yard.
Okay. Scott, can you speak to the question of when you have sort of stormwater runoff, how contaminated it typically is in one of these kind of semi-urban areas? Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, so there's a combination of contaminants that you can get from the surface water runoff. They run from pathogens, you can imagine animal waste and so on that washes down, along with a few typically low concentration of metals. So rubber, as an example, tends to have a lot of zinc in it. And so when you have stormwater runoff that's going across the roadways, you're going to pick up some zinc. By and large, those concentrations are low enough that you're probably not going to have much of a problem. And in fact, zinc's a micronutrient as well. So without testing, I would be hesitant to say absolutely, but my guess would be is that you would be totally fine using that surface reservoir for irrigating your lawns or in your landscape. Without treatment, I would not want to do drinking water, no.
Don't drink that water.
And Nusha, do you want to comment on how the water control boards tend to think about using these surface waters?
Yeah, so actually our new storm water management regulation is focused on using stormwater, putting it in beneficial use. So putting more green infrastructure to capture that water as soon as it comes down rather than letting it actually flow and capture all these contaminants. We have a lot of focus on trash. I know it's not an issue for you, but actually trash can be an issue that contaminates and pollutes water and then prevents it from being used. But the purpose, the goal of that, our new regulation is to actually try to capture water as it falls and let it infiltrate right there and then, rather than letting it. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Surface consumption.
Surface consumption, then it's basically, you have to always filter that water before you use it if you're using groundwater. But it's a totally different process depending on what kind of groundwater system do you have, what quality it is. It's a different issue. But we use 50% of our water outdoors. So so that will be plenty for you.
Another question. Over. You could wait for the microphone, Roberto.
Okay.
I'm running it up.
Well, I'll talk loudly while it's coming up. So I'm Tom Neal. I don't know squat about water, but I know something about processes. And so as I look at various processes, for example, garbage, Our garbage system, well, it's industrial. We create something, we use it, and then we have a garbage stream that goes that way. And the state has done this incredible thing about saying, oh, well, we're going to put our noose around the old garbage stream and got a pretty good control of it, forcing things. I lived, for example, 20 years ago in a county in Germany that had no landfill. I mean, you could actually come along and say, no landfill, folks, and boy, all kinds of people upstream would change their behavior and do dramatic things. The whole gas thing, the reason we got more efficient cars was not because we're running out of gas, it's because we didn't like smog anymore. You know, it's the tail end of the process that's in some ways kind of drives the front end of the process. And I was just wondering from a process standpoint, what are the big control points that you've got along this whole water stream? You know, it seems like dealing with the waste end or the output end is certainly a possible control point. You may have other control points, and there are ones that say a regulatory group would go after and say, I want to try to control that control point because I got this 19th century legal structure or something like that. What kind of things can you reach in and grapple and try to kind of change for the 20-year, 25-year future type thing?
Great question. I knew that. I mean, it's partly about fragmentation. Do you want to speak to the way you think about fragmentation, or Joaquin? It'd be great to hear your thoughts on sort of where the regulatory interventions, whether we need more robust water markets, whether we need to get rid of the historical water rights allocations. I didn't advocate anything, but.
Okay, so I would say from trash perspective, that's actually a great example you brought up, because as I said, our new stormwater permit includes trash management. So we are actually asking all these cities that are under regional board in the Bay Area, and I think these other boards are also picking it up, to actually manage trash before it makes it to our creeks and water supply. And it's not just that, it's also homelessness. I mean, when I was appointed to that board, I thought I'm going to deal with water quality issues that I deal with, like a lot of them you can't even imagine, like homelessness, homeless shelters, trash management, how many times streets are being cleaned. All of those are issues that actually, and this goes back to your comment on process, preventing pollution rather than dealing with it after it happens. It's actually a huge issue. And I think one other thing I would say is there is a lot of conversation going on around recycling and reusing and circular economy for water, which means that how much you can use water before you let it go. And our cities in the future are not going to look like what we have right now. We're going to have more recycling. You're going to capture the stormwater. We're going to try to use that water as much as we can. The only problem we are having is our laws and regulations are not necessarily catching up to some of the solutions that we have. And again, our money flow and financial resources are not set to catch up to some of these solutions that we already have in place that they can be implemented. So to fix the process, we have to definitely revisit the laws, and then I let Joaquin to deal with all the.
I appreciate the question. You know, it's something that it crosses my mind a lot as well, and I know a lot of our staff is, you know, how do we approach this more in a sort of systems thinking way? And I think sometimes the challenge, though, is just how disparate water management is in the state, obviously. You know, we have over 7,000 water agencies delivering drinking water alone. And so when we talk about all the disparate sort of choices that are made in a watershed at every different level amongst different entities, it becomes really incumbent that we have sort of a systems thinking and approach to it. So, and thankfully kind of water lends itself when you think of, you know, going upstream, if you will, and in very just actual, you know, very literal ways when we talk about headwaters management, right? Going and saying, how do we look at that water cycle, to Nusha's point, as sort of a circular economy that the resource really actually is, and start to embed some of that thinking in our interactions and how we manage the resource writ large. The challenge, of course, again, is that it's not, you know, the state board saying thou shalt, because there are just so many entities. And so it's really about what are the tools then that all of our disparate entities, if you will, that manage water in their different ways, use to come to common decision supports and to see the same information, if you will. And so there's a lot of tremendous opportunity in a lot of that. And it's certainly, a focus for us is how do you develop those 21st century tools, those decision support tools that aggregate data better and then allow us to make communal decisions from that, aggregate data and our understanding of it. Hopefully that's somewhat helpful. I'm not going to touch water rights law.
I mean, maybe to
As an issue right now, at least.
Maybe to pile on a little bit. I mean, we could talk about demand side management. It's not. It's about water use too, and smart metering, and in my opinion, investing more in tiered pricing. The belief that long term we ought to be paying more to water our lawns than we pay to fill our glasses in houses and things like that. And metering, smarter metering and demand side management would allow us to do that and think about the system in more integrated ways, better use of gray water than we do. And that's partly a historical issue and partly a regulatory issue too. But all of those factors, I think, come into bearing for me.
Can I add some?
I was going to say,
Yeah.
and I just want to give California credit for really doing a workman-like job, a work-person-like job on water conservation over the last several decades. And it's really dramatic how much we've seen the population and economy and agricultural output grow without really substantial increases in water consumption over recent decades. And there's a lot to learn from the things we've already accomplished.
Yeah, and I just want to say that actually, it's great that you asked that question because this public awareness is such a key point of changing our behavior and the way we do things. We did this research where we work a lot on this demand side management and how do you use data to inform policy and behavior and water use. And we did this study that looked at California's water use during the drought. And one of the things we found was before state came in and put the mandatory water use restrictions on different communities, the amount of media coverage that California got on the drought, the issues around drought, how we are running out of water, all the pictures that you saw in the newspaper on the reservoirs going dry, actually prompted people to change their behavior, and they dropped their water use so significantly that you can see it actually. And this was even before the state went in and said, you know what, we want to have mandatory water use restrictions on every community because we are really running out of water. So I think public awareness is part of the process that needs to be sort of more focused on and sort of tapped into.
Other questions? Please wait for the mic.
Hi, Ken Weinberg. I'm a council member for the Delta Stewardship Council, but I have spent my career in water in Southern California. So I agree on fragmentation of regulations. And I've been part of the regulated community for most of my career. But I got to give the State Water Board and Joaquin some real credit in evolving the system as it gets to reuse and recycling. And we're doing a lot of that in Southern California. But when the Division of Drinking Water was formed at the state board, and then you had sort of the state board and the regional boards, for potable reuse, that kind of brought all the main players together. And I think what the state board did in adopting the surface water augmentation regulations really, at least my part of Southern California, San Diego, we don't have big groundwater basins where we can do this. So it was that collaboration between the state board, the regional board, and the Division of Drinking Water that established a permitting process, which maybe it could go faster, but they're talking to each other, and you have different drivers. I mean, the regional board is focused on discharge and the water quality needed to go into a lake, where you've got the Division of Drinking Water focused on public health protection and what has to come out of that and go into the system. So I want to just be optimistic that states learning, there's clearly more to go. One example is the Department of Fish and Wildlife sort of commented on the potable reuse surface water augmentation that gee, you're taking all the nutrients out of the lake, and that's going to affect the fish, where the regional board is saying, take the nutrients out of the water before you discharge it. So I think there was some behind-the-scenes discussion, and, I think the water side prevailed. But, that's clearly, the action is at the local agencies, and the research needs that I've seen are really at the local agencies, and some of it is wastewater treatment, and how do you treat the wastewater so you can use it, because the water reuse is really contingent on treatment technology. And I've been around a long time because I'm old, but just give you some insight on Orange County, that whole seawater intrusion barrier stuff, that was a stalking horse for water supply and potable reuse. In fact, the treatment plant was called Water Factory 21, but from a public perception basis, nobody thought, this had to be stepped into slowly. And we're in a much different world now, thankfully.
Anybody want to comment on that one? Congratulations, Joaquin, for getting that.
I'll quickly take advantage of it. Thank you. No, I appreciate the acknowledgement, and actually I have to then further push that acknowledgement over to the previous chair, Felicia Marcus, the board that she inherited in 2013, and I have now the pleasure of inheriting in 2019, is a very different place because of her leadership, and particularly around the Division of Drinking Water coming over from the Department of Public Health to the state board, which I continue to argue and proudly say that it really has set us up to be a 21st century regulatory agency on water that you don't see anywhere else in the nation. To have an entity that has both, first and foremost, 50 years now of Porter Cologne, which, historically said water quantity and quality cannot be separated, and so must be within a singular entity to be able to manage jointly, and to have the division, to have drinking water over now as a program on the regulatory side really completes us and lets us break down those silos and allow the Division of Drinking Water and the regional water quality control boards to have relationships, discussions, and on this theme of greater systems thinking and sophistication, understand, how best to try to streamline, but also protect public health and continue to improve the quality of our water. So I just have to acknowledge again just the tremendous leadership that I'm fortunate to come in after here to continue to push and say, okay, well, what does that next iteration look like? When we first brought over the Division of Drinking Water, it was very much a don't scare the Division of Drinking Water because it was coming over from another entity. It's the big change. It's a huge shift. And but now 5 years under our belt, I think it is time about how do we continue to better integrate their work and continue to see ourselves in a single entity with a single mission that's pretty broad and has all these fantastic opportunities to really think again more sophisticatedly and holistically around these issues. So
Great, thank you. There was another question up here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Steve Baker. I love these conversations. Several weeks ago, I had the opportunity to meet with Secretary Bruce Babbitt at Crocker Art Museum, and he spoke. He was reinforcing the promotion of volunteer agreements, settlement agreements, which he was trying to say that we are fighting from our own silos. Everybody's coming from their own silo. Okay, that's one point. Second point, our mayor of Sacramento once said, and this is probably a year or two ago, that he used the word principled compromise. I think that's a good word because somebody's always going to be affected when water changes quality or changes its flow, goes somewhere else. So are there any examples where principled compromises are being made so it's not the dollar necessarily, it's not any benefit of a particular company or utility or so forth, but it's a principled compromise? An extreme example of that might be the human right to water, I suppose.
That's a great question. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I think I would say in the Bay Area we are trying to deal with some of the issues we have with the Bay, and there is a lot of collaboration right now and sea level rise. So there's a lot of collaboration right now going on in the Bay Area for that. We have set up this. A couple of years ago, we passed Measure AA, which brings money in to deal with sea level rise, and that money actually has become an incentive for some of the communities around the Bay to work together to deal with, to build more resilient communities. So what kind of infrastructure do we need? What kind of sea protection, bay protection do we need? What entities needs to be at the table for that? We are also doing the same thing at the regional board with different entities working together, working with us, because, for example, everything that we permit, it's not just the regional board. We also have the Army Corps of Engineers that needs to permit some of these infrastructure that we built with flood management. We have some of the other entities. We have BCDC, which is the Bay Area Water Conservation and Development entity. So we all give permits. So we have to all work together. So some of these issues that have all these entities involved in permitting, we have been trying to get them all sit at the table and do this collaboration beforehand, these conversations beforehand. Then people don't need to go from one regulatory agency to another regulatory agency to another regulatory agency and hear different things, because we all have different mandates. So I would say we are trying in the Bay Area to do some of that, but also Bay Area is a very small regionally, so it lends itself to some of this collaboration because it's very urbanized and communities are very close to each other.
You know, one other element I think is important when we think about these principled compromises, and maybe this is what Secretary Abbott was speaking to, was that in many cases the situation changes from one actor having an opportunity to take advantage of being able to externalize some cost, but where a relatively subtle change can lower the cost barrier for everyone and push you toward a win-win. And I think water conservation is a beautiful example of how you can deal with a major externality in a system in a way that distributes responsibility and may result in an overall net cost, but it's a small net cost that's borne by lots of different actors. And I think the kinds of scholarship that you've heard about today and the kinds of policies that the state's trying to implement really go a long way toward distributing the costs enough so that the kind of principled compromise you're talking about can occur without having to make a gigantic sacrifice from any of the individual actors.
Maybe jumping in as I was sitting here thinking of some examples. I think one example of principled compromise would be things like rice farming in the valley and bird flyways, and trying to manage a pretty complicated situation. But the rice farms and the water availability are taking the place of traditional wetlands, are important for as flyways and bird habitat, and I think people are trying to do the best they can to sort of create that opportunity and maintain that opportunity. Another example in the conservation space would be watershed management, and Lake Tahoe, Catskills in the New York area is the best example, but compromises on what we'll do with land surrounding watersheds to ensure the quality of that water, but also perhaps preserve those habitats and those lands as well. So I think there are examples of those kinds of compromise that people are making real progress and doing the best they can.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I'll ask one if no one else will.
There are a couple more hands back there. So, yeah, right there.
Afternoon. My name is Matt Keeling. I'm with the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. I have a question for Rob. You alluded to kind of cost-benefit associated with water quality monitoring. So Senate Bill 4, hydraulic fracking bill that was approved by our legislature in 2014, required the State Water Board to develop water quality monitoring requirements and to implement them for hydraulic fracking. And so I'm curious what your perspective may be regarding the relative need for water quality monitoring associated with produced water disposal relative to the potential risks associated with those activities, and also particularly with respect to the disparity between the amount of hydraulic fracking that's actually occurring in the state versus the disposal of produced water.
So I sat on the groundwater monitoring committee, the scientific committee that arose out of SB4, and so I guess my personal opinion, I kind of hinted at this in my opening statements. I think most of the public concern tends to go towards hydraulic fracturing and sort of the extraction side, and I think I believe we're underinvesting in the monitoring on the wastewater side. And that's not to say that people aren't aware of that issue. The state's made a lot of progress, especially in the last 5 years in this area. But I think systematically we don't pay enough attention to the 55,000 Class 2 injection wells in the state. I think we're not the percolation unlined pits have received a lot of attention recently, but that practice has been going on for many decades. And with the beneficial use clause for Western states where you can reuse water, especially say below 10,000 ppm for TDS, we don't do a lot of monitoring in sort of low-level constituents, both naturally occurring and things that are added into the water through various industrial activities. So I think I would love to see us shift our balance towards more monitoring, more attention paid to that wastewater side, because I think that is a much bigger issue for the state. Again, for 130 billion gallons, it's a much bigger issue than the extraction side and the chemicals that we're putting in. It's actually what we're taking out. Much of that is naturally occurring, as Scott alluded to. So I think that would be my answer, to pay more attention to the disposal side and keep track of that water and what's in that water, and make that information publicly available.
One more question back here. Back here. I know I saw one more hand. So we'll make this the last question.
My name is Phil Welker, and I understand that the challenge of ensuring a safe and reliable water supply for the residents of California excuse me, is very challenging and multi-solution driven. But I did have a question for the entire panel. If you were given the mandate of being the person in charge of having to ensure that the state going forward has a safe and reliable water supply, is there one action or strategy that you would take that you would consider be the most important thing to do to ensure that supply?
A good question to close on. We can just run down the panel if you want.
Yeah, one thing. So I'm pretty locked on groundwater. So when I look forward, and it was alluded to already, that the Sierra snowpack is going to become Sierra rainfall, and as we have that, we have to think about where to put that water. And surface reservoirs are going to be part of the solution, but a minimal one. So it's going to have to be the groundwater. So I think about coming up with a strategy for carefully getting the water back into the ground and managing our groundwater system, for me, is probably the key challenge for the future of California over the many decades going forward.
I guess for me, in spite of all the discussion, the attention to produced water and managed recharge and all the chemistry that things that occur and could occur, I think for me it's still about conservation. It's about reducing the amount of water that we use, and that will almost certainly come partly through pricing in the future, but also behavioral changes. I think the drought, the recent drought, really provided a nice example of people changing their behavior, just providing them information in how much water they were using. I'll tell you a quick story. So we moved here during the drought about 5 years ago and moved into a house where the watering came on 3 times a day, and we had rented the house a month before we moved into it. So I got my first water bill, and I was using more than twice as much water as my average neighbor, and I wasn't living in the house yet. And that was because our landlord, because I was renting, was using a lot of water. But that kind of information provided to people, had a measurable effect in reducing how much water people use, just giving them that information. So my answer is still the tried and true efficiency and conservation approach?
Lucky to go last. I guess I would take both of those. And then honestly, I think from my perspective, it's more actually creating a coordinated manner as we diversify our water supply portfolio. So every community right now considering different ways of diversifying their water supply. Water that comes from obviously the Sierra Nevada or different dams are not necessarily going to meet all our demand in the future. We have to manage our groundwater better. We have to do more recycling. We have to capture stormwater. We have to clean up our groundwater wherever we can. We have to, actually the first step, as Rob said, conservation and efficiency. But the reality is these options are not available to everyone everywhere because some people have done a lot more efficiency and conservation, so their next step might be recycling. People who have done recycling might have other options, or actually locally, we have local and regional limitations on what we can do, what we cannot do. And one of the things my team have been working on and we have been promoting a lot is creating something similar to portfolio standards for energy portfolio standards, water diversification standards. You can say every community in California, every region has to have, let's say 30% of the water coming from alternative water supplies, whatever that 30% is. And you can start from conservation, go to recycling, go to groundwater recharge or management or anything you want, but it has to come from diversified sources. And then enable these communities to work together the way we do it with energy and allow them to actually build these diversified water supply portfolios as a coordinated way. So then you can take advantage of wastewater in a better way, recycle more, actually try to create more circular systems that you can use water as many times you can in the communities depending on where they are. So that's my sort of issue that I'm very excited about, and I think it will create a more coordinated manner and allow more partnerships as we deal with water resiliency in the future.
Joaquin, would you like to use that question to launch your new initiative? Or
And then Joaquin will make that happen for me.
Let me, let me close on that question by providing the thought that, what you've heard from all of us today, and I think it's been really reinforced by the questions, is that everybody's thinking about finding ways to not use a drop more than we need and to get the maximum value out of every drop. And it's a complicated problem. California's been dealing with it for decades, and we really have in the state and in the science you've heard a great deal of sophistication. And most of the issues concern this complicated interface between the human dimensions, the legislative dimensions, and the technical and geological dimensions. I'm impressed at the level of progress that's been made and at the consistent direction. I really enjoyed hearing the perspectives from Nusha, from Rob and Scott, and especially appreciate the opening comments from Joaquin. The comments from all of you were incredibly helpful in unfolding important aspects of this issue. And I hope that as we move forward, we can really think of ourselves as a team tackling one of the most challenging but important issues of the 21st century. So thanks so much. And don't leave. What we really would like if all of you would hang out and join us for a reception where we can continue the conversation in an informal way. So thanks again.
Very well done.